what I feel has been lost is the economic analysis to go with that. A real grounding in political economy, an understanding of financial and monetary systems, how those function in practical terms, whether we agree with them or not, to understand them so we can better diagnose the ills and propose solutions that are grounded in a practical understanding of how they work, rather than thin narratives about the poor distribution of wealth and standing up villains that we cast as responsible for all the ills. It may be that there are some villains involved here, but without fundamentally understanding monetary financial systems and having a more robust political economic analysis of what underlies some of our social ills, I think our approaches are going to continue to be inadequate. And I find inadequacy in a lot of what's coming out of the left these days, quite frankly.
Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, where we explore the intersection of Bitcoin and progressive issues. I'm your host, Mark Stefani. My guest today is Scott Wolfe. Scott is the Executive Director at the Canadian Association of Community Health Centres. Scott's focus is addressing public policy and funding for these community health centers. In combination with his master's in political science, Scott brings a rich and diverse base of knowledge to Bitcoin. I wanted him on the show because he has demonstrated a rare ability to cut through a lot of the social media noise and deliver insight into why he believes Bitcoin to be a force for good. This was a rich conversation and one that I know that you will enjoy. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right, Scott Wolfe, thank you so much for joining me on the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast. I'm happy to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Mark. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. My pleasure. You are a delight to follow on Twitter. I don't know if it's just the Canadian upbringing, but you are somebody I think many of us want to emulate because you are incredibly patient and kind on a social media platform where that is not encouraged. So having had the opportunity to speak with you outside of this podcast, I know that rings true in real life. So again, I'm grateful that you're here.
Thanks so much. It's that means a lot to me. It's that's something I aspire to. It's not always easy. It's sometimes more delicious to take that pot shot back and go tit for tat with people on social media, especially when our emotions come into play. But I really aspire to bring it down a few notches. Look for common ground and like to think of myself as a bridge builder. So it's something I'm growing into. Thanks. I appreciate the comment.
I'm grateful that this is in fact your first podcast. You've had, like I said, incredible insights on social media, but now your first podcast. And so it's obviously going to be helpful for the listeners to have a better idea of who Scott Wolfe is and his background.
Sure. So originally from Ottawa, capital city of Canada, grew up there, went to university there, did my undergraduate degree in political science and communication studies. From there, went on to do a graduate degree in political science. Maybe I'll speak just a little bit about my educational background because I think that's sort of an interesting backstory to who I am and how I approach the Bitcoin space. In my teen years, did a fair amount of work related to a fair amount of social justice work, largely focused on race relations, racial justice, and moved into my undergraduate degree thinking that I would focus on global development, human rights, at which I did. But somewhere along the way, I think in those, formative years, late teens, early 20s, was having a really hard time reconciling, just the weight of all of that, my place in the world, et cetera. And steered towards political philosophy a bit more than I did my human rights, global development, and communications work. I think, in all honesty, because it was more comfortable to say, rather than take on the weight of all of these, really tough questions, my place in the world, I'm just going to go up to the mountaintop, find the answer, come back down, and have it all solved. I'm going to find truth with a capital T.
So was that more of a intellectual pursuit rather than an action-based endeavor? Is that what you're getting at?
It was both. I think it was a retreat from, like I said, the weight of dealing with the challenges of global development, race relations, social injustice, et cetera. And rather than try to hash that all out through the interpersonal relationships and the real life activities, let me just go up to that mountaintop, find the truth, and come back with it and be done. And I share that because that was an important lesson for me. I came out of that. I emerged from that. I think throughout my undergraduate degree, I was a bit of a double agent. On the one hand, all of these, day-to-day activities, relationships, et cetera, that were very much about, global development, building a more inclusive world, et cetera. Then in my academic pursuits was veering more towards the mountaintop, capital T, truth activities. And it took me until the end of my undergraduate degree and into my graduate degree to finally come to terms, I think, with that and to try to steer back towards a more applied humanistic approach. I share that because I see similar, tendencies when we talk about climate change, when we talk about other social challenges that we face today, and within the Bitcoin community as well, to seek that capital T truth, that meta narrative that Bitcoin fixes this, removing the human element, the applied element, and so that lesson from my late teens, early 20s, and of course it continues to be a work in progress to find that balancing act between theory, narrative, and the real life practical aspects of what we're dealing with, is something that sticks with me. And I try to remember that when I come back to my engagements today, to your earlier point about trying to be diplomatic and polite and engaging. It really is trying to bring it back down to a human level, look to what unites us, what we have in common, before we then go to what distinguishes us and what we may disagree about.
Let me make sure I understand your arc correctly here. Early on in your late teens, early 20s, you were involved more in the day-to-day action and advocacy side of things, community engagement, I would imagine, but then felt like, again, you wanted to seek out this capital T truth from maybe more of an intellectual academic perspective, but then realized that wasn't the answer either, and you've kind of swung back to the other side of the spectrum. Is that accurate?
That's right. You said it much better than I did.
I don't know about that. And so now you're working in community health. Is that correct?
Correct.
Tell us about that position.
Sure. So, eventually, as I was saying, I eventually moved on to a graduate degree in political science and decided after my master's degree that I would take a year off, which has turned into 20 years, before pursuing a PhD. Did an internship with the World Health Organization in Washington, D.C. My intention was to go back and do a PhD focused on international development, human rights, and coincidentally discovered through the World Health Organization internship health as an avenue to pursue human rights. Was working in the area of non-communicable diseases, social development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and sort of latched onto it and decided I would run with it for a bit, because if you look at the questions of, let's say, land distribution in Central America or Latin America on the grounds of human rights and socioeconomic development, et cetera, you will come up against political forces that are calcitrant and challenging to overcome. But if you can make a similar argument on the grounds of the health of a population, that if you don't redistribute land, you're going to be facing an epidemic of dengue fever or something like that. It's a very strategic, tactical way to approach some of the same questions. And so, decided I would pursue that thread further and continue to work with the World Health Organization for a couple years. Transitioned over to another NGO in the States focused on HIV/AIDS prevention and care globally. So working with physicians primarily throughout the world on scale up of antiretroviral treatments, and then made a move back to Canada, where I sort of made a sideways movement into the community health center world. Didn't know community health centers by the name, but as I got to know community health centers here in Canada, realized that, this was a way of describing effective health and social interventions that I'd already witnessed in practice in other parts of the world. They just hadn't been known by the name of community health center. But they were, in essence, multifaceted, locally stewarded health, integrated health and social service efforts to improve the population of the health of a local population. And I've been working with community health centers now for, going on 17, 18 years.
I didn't know you were that old, Scott.
It's the baby face.
That's right. That's right. You and I both. I get the impression that your work, while you're passionate about it and fulfilling, there's an element of discouragement. And I can probably relate to that, being in the healthcare field as well. But I sense that thread with you, and I sense that thread pulls into your overall frustration with the progressive movement and some of these causes that mean a great deal to you. You've gone from advocacy, boots on the ground, traveling, community efforts when you're young and being discouraged and overwhelmed with that, to trying to find, again, the intellectual answer for all these problems, and now swinging back to the other side, but still recognizing the challenge faced with the boots on the ground approach and some of the bureaucracy that you're facing. Can you tell us more about those frustrations that you're experiencing with, not only with in the healthcare sector itself, but how that's overlapped now into more your political identity as a progressive, center left, and some of these other human rights issues that you care about?
I guess I would say that the frustrations are layered. At base, the frustrations have to do with broken systems, broken structures, and perverse incentives. We see those, across the board in society, politically, and those translate into healthcare, but more broadly, health-focused efforts as well. We continue to have a healthcare system, in Canada, the United States, the UK, and elsewhere, that was initially structured. So putting aside, insurance and payment schemes and all of that for a sense, just fundamentally the structure and the approaches towards health and healthcare, systems that were structured for an agrarian economy, perhaps a manufacturing economy, the world of, the late 19th century, perhaps early 20th century, where the Marcus Welby family physician approach, was at the center, a treatment-focused approach. And our knowledge about what has an impact on health, 80 to 90% of which is outside of the healthcare system, hasn't been well enough integrated into those approaches. So that's the one, that's one issue when it comes to healthcare. We continue to, approach health predominantly through systems and structures that are treatment oriented and that place responsibility for care within, the hands of a small subset of individuals working in very fragmented structures themselves, hospitals, primary care offices, and so forth. So there's that broader systemic approach, and so I find hope and inspiration working with community health centers, because at the level of health and healthcare, it's an approach that seeks to remedy that by integrating at the level of services, healthcare with a variety of social services, those social determinants of health that have such an impact on people's opportunity for well-being and ultimately ability to maintain health.
So what I was getting at was I know that we've spoken previously about some of your frustrations with, again, the incentives that are present in healthcare, but that is also translated into, again, your more progressive politics. Can you speak to your frustrations there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think more broadly, our analysis of the challenges we face in terms of social, economic, and climate justice, how to build the better, more inclusive society have also been fragmented. So the same way that we've taken a siloed approach to healthcare, treatment of the individual, treatment of the family, treatment of the community through a fragmented approach, that applies at a broader social level. I'm not sure where this happened, but it feels as though at some point the center left, of which where I find I'm at home in terms of values, of vision, and practical solutions focused at social inclusion and social justice. We've lost important elements of analysis that can give us the picture we need to construct, practical solutions. To get more concrete, I absolutely believe in the need to dedicate a lot of our attention to sociological, psychological, cultural aspects of the challenges that we face, how it is we achieve social inclusion in the workplace, in education, and beyond. What I feel has been lost is the economic analysis to go with that. A real grounding in political economy, an understanding of financial and monetary systems, how those function in practical terms, whether we agree with them or not, to understand them so we can better diagnose the ills and propose solutions that are grounded in a practical understanding of how they work, rather than thin narratives about the poor distribution of wealth and standing up villains that we cast as responsible for all the ills. It may be that there are some villains involved here, but without fundamentally understanding monetary financial systems and having a more robust political economic analysis of what underlies some of our social ills, I think our approaches are going to continue to be inadequate. And I find inadequacy in a lot of what's coming out of the left these days, quite frankly.
And in as much as you saw health as a means to human rights, it sounds like you are now seeing money, economic systems as also a lens by which to view human rights. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And, I don't want to, for a second, portray myself as some sort of sage. I've come about, this the theory of a gap in the progressive movement and, political left by way of my own journey of understanding over the past few years. This was a gap that I had in my own, analyses of social, political, and economic challenges, until a few years ago. Bitcoin is a part of that journey, but it's not, the the only reason for that journey. Um, so this has been a project of discovery for myself, and I'm trying to be authentic and intellectually honest about where I've been, where I am, and where I think I'm going. Hoping to invite peers from the progressive movement, if you want to call it such, to also take a closer look.
Tell us about your Bitcoin journey.
Sure. So it didn't start with it. It actually started with an honest attempt to understand money, finances, personal finances, and take a more active interest in those.
What spawned that?
I would say that up until about 2018 or so, I was what I would characterize as a somewhat common, progressive, in that I had a very awkward relationship with money, a very awkward relationship with the idea of wealth, that it's something that's there. It's something I operate within a market-based, to live within a market-based society, but there's somehow some shame in participating in it. It's something we don't do. It's something that fulfills a need, a function. There's a utility value to it, but conversations around money, financial systems, monetary systems, structures, etc., are things that those people on the right hand side of the political spectrum do, because that's their primary interest. And so there was a caricature of who should be interested in money, why, its relative value, and associating it with a lot of social ills, without a lot of research to ground that sort of attitude. And I find that that's something that's sort of shared as a cultural norm, across the political center to left. Having said that, I have a pretty diverse group of friends, a lot of whom are really committed to issues of social justice, social inclusion, et cetera, and happen to work in the financial industry or other, private sector industries. And, over the course of years, we've had some really engaging, thoughtful conversations, not only about this, but I think just the example of them as individuals who work in the private sector, work in finance, et cetera, and are, nonetheless, committed to building the better world that I think we want to see. It gave me pause. And so I made that commitment about 2018, 2019, to start taking a closer look, starting with my own personal finances. What is my relationship to money? What should that be for my family? And how do I situate this, in a broader perspective of what I want society to look like? And so that was the impetus for my journey. Not to take up too much time on this, started looking at what I felt comfortable investing in, what, pension plans are invested in, trying to understand how this work led me to some, understanding of how markets work, equity markets, bond markets, credit markets, and, looking at the idea of a balanced portfolio. Started hearing about this thing again. I'd heard about it previously, but only in name. Started hearing about this thing, Bitcoin, and thought, maybe this is something that should go in an investment portfolio, maybe 1 or 2%. Let me buy some of this thing and get to know what it is. So it was strictly on that grounds that I first encountered Bitcoin, and little did I know, the sort of journey it would take me on from there.
Well, thank you so much for being so candid. And I can relate to that sentiment in the sense that you feel a little uncomfortable thinking about money, wanting to learn about it, wanting to better understand it because of its caricature for conservatism. And yet everything that underpins human rights and social justice, what are the means by which we want to address those things? Money.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's a little, in hindsight, disingenuous to not want to better understand those things. But I get you, you start question it. You start reading those books. You're like, oh God, am I going to vote Republican next year? Next year, like, what's going on here? But
Yeah.
what you end up realizing is that the labels end up being so enigmatic, so almost meaningless. Like, are honestly, you can't necessarily slap a label on in how I feel politically at this point. And I think Bitcoin and understanding money had a lot to do with that. The values and the initiatives, all of that has remained the same for me. But labeling me, Democrat, conservative, libertarian, progressive, it's like, well, what does that mean to you? And you start to step back from this, as you said, the caricature of what it should be. And once you move past that uncomfortable feeling of, oh God, am I not being a good progressive? It's much more, the door's open, and it's much more liberating to be able to refocus on the things that you care about. Because you're not concerned about being necessarily true to what people believe that entity should be, that identity should be. No, you recommit to the goals that brought you into that ideology in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that it's so easy for us to mistake perverted and unfair manifestations of a thing with the thing itself.
Yes, absolutely.
Bad government driven by money, driven by perverse incentives, to confuse that with the idea of government and collectivism.
Right.
And similarly, where I've come to, and it's an ongoing journey, is that I do believe that there is good in markets, in a market system where there are methods of exchange that are abstracted so that I can exchange this abstraction for something that I want or need, irrespective of the fact that I produce it or that that I don't have something of value to exchange in return for it, other than this abstraction, which is money. I think that there's tremendous value in some of that development, and in terms of what enables by way of social progress. We can get into the ills of our fiat system and so forth. But fundamentally, the idea of markets, the idea of exchange, the idea of being able to accrue value, are fundamentally good. Now, how do we take those fundamental concepts and build from them systems and structures that achieve not perfection? I'm not looking for a utopia, but for something better than we have currently, and something that enables us to actually place human dignity at the core and distribute whatever it is we consider wealth, more universally, more globally, so that we don't have the disparities that have been accumulating for centuries.
So when was it that you saw Bitcoin as potentially more than just something to put into your portfolio?
It's taken shape gradually. I would say it's probably a couple years now that I had that aha moment. This is much more than an investment. It's been reassuring and affirming to hear so many people say that they came for the number go up and they stayed for the the evolution / revolution that has been an entry point for so many people. But you come in and you hear about this this magic internet money, and all the headlines are talking about its relative value based on scarcity, and some of those first encounters with the fundamental properties of Bitcoin, and you chew on that for a little bit, and then you go another layer deeper, and you understand how Bitcoin is juxtaposed against fiat, and you learn about the end of the gold standard and what that unleashed in terms of money, and our global monetary system. And you go another layer deeper to understand how that recycles through bond and credit markets, and you learn more about debt and GDP and so forth and so on, and then the particular examples of what this means to different people, different nations, communities around the world, and it builds and I can't say exactly when and where the aha moment was, but it was at some point, probably a couple of years ago, understanding the value proposition of Bitcoin, not strictly as an investment asset, but as a technology and tool to restructure, reshape broken systems. That that was my aha moment, the point where I said, okay, this is bigger, and really, accelerated my learning journey.
And in some sense, it seems to have followed the same arc that you went through in your career, where you found out about Bitcoin, and while there maybe wasn't an activism, boots on the ground type moment at that time with Bitcoin, you went on that intellectual journey with it to better understand money, better understand the history of money, of finance, and so forth. And that arc then brought you back around to, well, how does that play out to the people that I interact with on a day-to-day basis? How does that interact with people worldwide, and how does that factor into the issues that I care about, which ultimately gets you back to how is it going to play out in these very concrete examples that we'll get to later with regard to, say, Bitcoin Beach or Bitcoin Lake, and so forth, back to your community efforts that you hold so dear. So a very interesting arc there, I think, that you experienced in the past.
No, absolutely. That's not lost on me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of your fantastic threads, Scott is known for his wonderful threads that he puts out on Bitcoin. And you had one where you talk about framing Bitcoin for policymakers, and you called it your walk and chew gum approach. And this approach, I gather, stems from how you see healthcare being presented and implemented within society, kind of, as you described earlier, a fragmented and siloed approach, in how we should be looking at it differently. And in turn, how policymakers should be looking at Bitcoin differently. Can you describe that walk and chew gum approach for us?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it really is asking policymakers to look across their silos to understand that we need intersectoral approaches to building the better world we want, and that fundamentally, if we take a housing only, a healthcare only, a seniors only, a youth only, an industry only approach to human development, they're fundamental flaws, because we live in a complex world with complex systems and structures that interact, and we need to better appreciate how those interact and the knock-on effects of each of those on each other. So with respect to Bitcoin, the analysis of its place in our society, the evolution, has been incredibly fragmented when it comes to generally mainstream media analysis, as well as political analysis, and most frustratingly, political analysis coming out of progressive movements. It has been exclusively on a narrow interpretation of climate concern and environmental impact. It has been on a narrow analysis and concern related to how Bitcoin fits in as an investment technology, or investment asset, and to what extent and by whom it should be regulated, so forth, without drawing that thread or weaving that thread between the various aspects of society and policy that Bitcoin touches upon. And so, I think that thread you're referring to, the idea of walking and chewing gum, was specifically a call for policymakers to take a look at Bitcoin's potential environmental impact, not strictly from an analysis of how much energy is used to mine Bitcoin, but its global value in terms of social, economic, and community development, the extent to which it is actually being used as a liberatory tool around the world is providing a financial on-ramp to hundreds of millions of unbanked individuals and individuals who face a myriad of forms of political persecution. So to examine its energy consumption, in relation to its utility, of which there's tremendous utility, and I would say that that isn't just a phenomenon of the global South, but there are scores of individuals, families, and communities that have been excluded from our legacy financial system for decades or centuries, that are finding benefit from Bitcoin in the United States and Canada, Europe, and elsewhere. So, to assess it in relation to its social utility, but also to look at it with respect to what it is, to some extent, perhaps completely into the future, but to some extent displacing. It is, as an investment asset, displacing gold as a store of value. So assess its environmental impact relative to the environmental impact of gold mining. We've allowed gold mining to, continue unassailed for decades, causing a tremendous amount of environmental degradation, and to say nothing of illicit human rights abuses in the global South, appropriation of land in Canada, in the United States, in the Amazon basin, and elsewhere. What is the environmental impact of our legacy financial system in terms of brick and mortar and all of the transactional activities of not just commercial banking, but intermediaries like Western Union and other intermediaries that play a part. So look at Bitcoin mining's environmental footprint with respect to those, but also, and wait, there's more. Look at the positive developments coming from Bitcoin mining in terms of what it does as an intermittent demand industry to actually provide the sort of reliable consumer of last resort for energy, which enables scale up of energy grids. Others point out much more eloquently than me that if we really want to make an impact on climate change, we need to electrify in a massive way. And that's not simple. If it was that simple, it would already have happened. Energy supply and demand and grids are incredibly complex. And Bitcoin mining plays a tremendously important niche role within that. In addition to offset of methane, and a myriad of other roles within addressing climate change itself that have a net benefit. So all of that to say, my walk and chew gum appeal to policymakers was, take a step back, zoom out, and look at Bitcoin mining and the network and technology, in the broader context of the social, economic, and political good that it's achieving, in your own jurisdiction as well as globally.
Yeah, that approach also, I think, applies to speaking one-on-one with friends and peers about Bitcoin. And it's fascinating, just as we acknowledge somehow passively, that money is involved in the issues that we care about, it's usually from a negative standpoint that it's all about the money, quote unquote,
Right.
or that there's perverse incentives there allowing for negative externalities. Yet we don't take the flip side of that scenario to understand that it is incentives. Let's change the incentives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Bitcoin very much does that as you described. And I'm curious to know if you've used those talking points, that approach with some of your friends who are in the finance industry, that I assume also, care about a lot of the issues that you do as well. How do they view Bitcoin?
Bitcoin's an acquired taste. There's a proof of work involved, right? To borrow the term. I think that there are different grounds on which people get it. Fundamentally, sort of where the roots finally take hold. With some folks, it's strictly on a sort of investment basis. Understanding, for instance, that if you're looking at it as an investment asset, you can look at something like Amazon as a comparator. I know that's not going to be the most palatable comparator for some audiences, but when you consider that Amazon as a disruptive business model, went through one or more 80% drawdowns in price, all the while its underlying business model was intact, and the adoption curve of and subscription to Amazon as a business model looked golden. And you appreciate the sort of growth trajectory of a disruptive asset like that. I think folks in the financial industry get it perhaps on that ground. They may also get it on the ground of some of the disruptive technology. So, for instance, via Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, transacting global payments and understanding how that's going to disintermediate businesses like Western Union, and perhaps PayPal and others. So I think there are those grounds, but I find that's some of the easier stuff and not necessarily where my attention is.
Mhm.
My focus isn't on, you would note from my Twitter thread when I talk about Bitcoin, it's never about Bitcoin as an investment asset, as a never talking about price action, etc. Even though, I do have an eye to some of that sort of stuff because that's part of the story. It really is about the, social, economic, and climate justice proposal of Bitcoin and what it's doing in practical terms. So that's where I try to spend my time.
But these individuals who care about the same social issues that you do and happen to work in finance only seem to focus on the financial elements of Bitcoin, is what you're saying?
Not exclusively. I think that's to some extent where the primary interest is.
Hmm.
What we're saying around Bitcoin's global development utility really is that it is going to disrupt financial, monetary, and political systems and structures that are fundamentally inequitable, unequal, and perpetuate the accrual of wealth to a limited few in a limited number of countries, to a large extent at the direct expense of the many in a much larger number of countries. Right? I mean, the example of the CFA franc and its its decades of colonial impact in Western and Central Africa, to the benefit of France over those decades is a prime example. We're looking to disrupt that, and obviously that sits just fine with me. I think that sits just fine with those of us who dedicate more of our time to social and global development. Perhaps it's something that sits okay with folks that work in the financial industry, but have an eye to social justice and human justice issues. But I imagine it's probably somewhat uncomfortable as well.
Sure. So boots on the ground, getting your hands dirty is certainly what it seems to be your passion these days, and for the entirety of your career, for that matter. What are your hopes for Bitcoin to that end? You've spoken a lot about Bitcoin Beach, Bitcoin Lake, Bitcoin Akasi, some of these projects that are looking to build circular economies and bring Bitcoin to the global South and everywhere. What are your hopes, your ideas, your thoughts about how we can best bring Bitcoin to the world?
Yeah, I mean, those examples are the beacons of hope to me, because not only do they demonstrate in practice how it is that Bitcoin can find roots at the local level and transform from strictly the technology and the asset to the practical use cases of bringing hope, bringing opportunity and inclusion to those communities and individuals in those communities. So I would love to see examples like that multiply hundreds of times throughout the world. Yeah, I think that there's a tension in you know we talk about the Bitcoin community. I mean, it's a community of communities. It's a vast network of people focused on different aspects of Bitcoin's use and value, and there are tensions within that. There are those who are focused on, and again, I don't want to inadvertently posit camps here and suggest that we're at significant odds, because I find that there's something unifying about Bitcoin. Lots of work still to be done, but there's something potentially very unifying about Bitcoin. But there are those who are focused on the price action. There are those who are focused on corporate adoption, on the expansion of Bitcoin mining and how that becomes industrialized and largely with a view to the financial benefit to be achieved from that, and coincidentally I think are also learning about and concerned with some of the global development aspects of Bitcoin, if for no other reason than global adoption is an underlying imperative for the for the number go up, so to speak. And then there are those of us who are really focused on, much more on the distribution and making sure that this technology finds its way into as many hands, as many communities around the world as possible. Because as disruptive and revolutionary as the technology is, if it accrues to only a small number of people and in a small number of countries, then ultimately its liberating potential, its development potential for us as a species has been significantly limited. And so my view is that Bitcoin mining and through renewables will take root throughout the world, that throughout the African continent, Latin America, Southeast Asia, we'll see hydro, solar, powered Bitcoin that enables not only the hash rate globally to be further distributed, but will help to accrue the wealth benefits to those parts of the world, and that more circular economies will take root, as we were talking about, similar to Bitcoin Lake and Bitcoin Beach and Bitcoin Akasi. Really that global adoption will truly be global. I'm excited to play whatever small part I can to make that happen.
Given your experience, your career is built on community efforts. What can we learn from your experience to make that goal a reality worldwide?
I think it is the power of community and the special role of community. I think a lot of Bitcoiners talk about, don't trust, verify, and that there's, the sovereign individual, et cetera. There's a small portion of individuals who are really non-statists who believe that we're disrupting, the aggregating negative impact of governments and so forth. I think it's a small subset, but there's, I think, a sweet spot when it comes to the future world that we want to habit, that is somewhere between the large state with an accumulating number of things that it is responsible for, and responsible for overseeing, through tax dollars and regulation, et cetera, on the one hand, and that libertarian view of the sovereign individual somewhere in the middle, where we have, where we've identified how best to organize ourselves collectively such that, we achieve economies of scale and can aggregate, goods to the collective, and also provide protection, to the minority, an ability to live in safety and peace, and so forth. And when we get to that point, I feel that there's got to be not only government, but there has to be some sort of collectivity at the community level. And so I think that the future world of, on the Bitcoin standard, and, as the world takes shapes, is more communitarian in nature, where entities or groupings like community health centers, community-based organizations, play a trusted role as intermediaries and trusted brokering parties at the community level, to accrue the benefit of living in a community, and to organize that such that, it has a net benefit for everyone there. I see that every day, as the shit hit the fan with COVID in the United States, in Europe, in Canada. It was really community health centers as nimble community organizations with relationships of trust that could pivot and mobilize quickly, knowing how best to address, the emerging needs of different members of the community. In some cases, individuals were cut off from their family, and they needed an organization to act as a connective tissue, to help them from falling into isolation and illness. And so these community organizations, like community health centers, like other community social service organizations, are connective tissue at a local level with enough degree of coordination and administration that they can, make sure that trains run on time, so to speak, and that not everyone has to, be a master of all the goods that they need and all the services that they need, but at the same time not being so large that they just are a morass of bureaucratic weight. And so I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it really is to see, a more organized role for community attached to Bitcoin globally. And that's why I say these, nascent movements and organizations like Bitcoin Beach, Bitcoin Lake, Bitcoin IFCHC, I think are the vision of, what we want more of globally, so that, absolutely, don't trust but verify. But at a certain moment, if we're going to live in a civil, organized society, that has rules and seeks to accrue goods to the benefit of the community, and hash that all up, we've got to have some sort of trusted entities to do that. And I think community organizations like that are key.
Maybe the Fedimans project will be the economic connective tissue that helps these communities flourish in that sense. It's certainly fascinating.
Really exciting. Yeah, really exciting development. Yeah.
Scott, final thoughts?
There's so much when you look around about which we could despair. There is a tremendous amount of divisiveness, politically, socially, accentuated via certain social media, concerns about a destabilizing world, um, different political tensions globally. And I feel that I would be slipping into, a bit of a depression were it not for the promise that I see emerging from things like Bitcoin. That somehow, amidst all of these challenges, that there's something better taking shape. And I'm not one of those who simply says Bitcoin fixes this, Bitcoin fixes everything. I mean, we need human agency to do so, but I think we have such a powerful tool from which to build a better world. And I see so many people doing that. And I see people who are doing that from their from the political perspectives into which they, or from which they, they came to Bitcoin. But gradually over time, I see connection. I know there's a lot of divisiveness still, but I see connection. I see people reaching across, political ideology and working this out. And there's still a lot of clouds, but I find tremendous hope in what we're doing. Your podcast and some of the others that I've seen that have been developing the area of education and dialogue, tremendous cause for hope. So I'm hopeful.
I want to add one more question here. I think a lot of individuals who care about the issues that we've discussed throughout this episode have devoted their lives and their careers to fighting for those issues by different means.
Mm-hmm.
And Bitcoin comes along and says, hey, I can fix those.
Right.
And I get the sense from a lot of these individuals that they're put off by that proposition. They're put off by perhaps maybe not fully recognizing that I've committed my life to doing this, fighting for these issues. I haven't perhaps made as much inroads or as much change as I had hoped. And now it's almost being averse to Bitcoin because it claims to do what I've been fighting for my whole life. What would you say to those individuals?
Yeah. I think I'd say I would be just like you coming from that perspective. For whatever reason, and at the time that I became acquainted with Bitcoin, and for whatever reason, it led me down the journey. Here I am. But if I were to imagine it otherwise, I would probably be coming from that same perspective. And I say that like with a deep humility. I'd want to say to folks that are working to fight, climate change, that, are working on issues of social, economic, political justice via other means, and for whom, Bitcoin comes along and seems like this, this cocky, kid who's saying, I'm going to eat your lunch sort of thing. Like, I get it. I appreciate it. I honor your work. I honor what you stand for. I share your values, but, I would very humbly ask you, take a look, if not to buy Bitcoin, just take a deeper look at some of the things that folks, perhaps like myself, other folks that have been interviewed on this podcast, have been saying related to the value and potential of Bitcoin. We really are aiming for the same, for the same things. With the deepest sincerity and humility, believe that this offers tremendous hope and potential, and hope that we can dialogue around it. But it's really a sincere, open invitation into that conversation. I think we're part of the same movement. We want the same thing. So, apologies if Bitcoin seems like this cocky kid that's coming to steal your lunch, sort of thing. It's I'm chuckling at that, right? It just seems preposterous. I can appreciate that, but let's talk.
Scott, what besides Bitcoin gives you hope?
My kids, kids in general, so beautifully open to the world in front of them, approaching it, with open eyes, without preconceived notions necessarily. And my three kids have been introduced to Bitcoin. We talk about it in the context of they're still pretty young, but we talk about it in the context of other things that we talk about: social justice, the environment, et cetera. And they take it seriously. They want a world that is fair, that has opportunity, that they want to materialize what I imagine, is only still a dream. But to look at that potential and through their eyes to see them engage gives me tremendous hope, and I'm sure that's something that most parents would echo. So I try to see myself as truly as a custodian of their future. They keep me honest.
Wonderful. Tell the listeners where they can find your work.
Sure. I'm mostly on Twitter. I'm on some other social media platforms, but rarely. So the best way would be on Twitter. I'm at Scott A. Wolfe. That's Wolf with an E. So SCOTTA, like Apple, Wolfe, WOLFE. Drop me a message. Would love to chat. We're in this together.
Thank you so much, Scott. This was wonderful.
Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to The Progressive Bitcoiner. If you enjoyed the show, head on over to Apple Podcasts and please leave a review. And don't forget, we have a website, theprogressivebitcoiner.com, where we have a lot of great content on Bitcoin and progressive issues. Thanks again for tuning in.